Alright, so once again, I decided to give the whole PC thing a go, and once again, I was completely underwhelmed by the experience. At least, this time, I was able to get through the game though. But honestly, the only reason I'm even including it in this video is because I played the game, so I might as well. So, same as last time, if you want to skip ahead to the review for Mega Man 3 on Game Boy, I'll throw in a timestamp. Otherwise, stick it out for a few minutes and watch my review of Mega Man 3 for PC, The Robots Are Revolting. So this one was made in 1994 from the same guy that did the first game, Steven Rosner, but this time it was under the umbrella of High-Tech Expressions. If I'm not mistaken, the only reason it got the title of Mega Man 3 is because one of the robots looked like the one on the NES box art for Mega Man 3, so they skipped 2 and called this one 3. Also, I think it was reworked into a Mega Man game. And you can tell because this game is a maze. It's not a linear platformer like every other game before it. It's more like a sandbox that you have to run through and explore to find the Robot Master, which sounds much more appealing than it actually was. For a game from the early 90s, the graphics are decent but not outstanding. The sprites are colorful and somewhat reminiscent of the classic Mega Man aesthetic, but they lack the finesse and detail seen in the console counterparts. The backgrounds are somewhat simplistic, and the animations can be a bit choppy. The core gameplay is somewhat true-ish to the Mega Man formula. Players control Mega Man as he battles through a series of levels, each ending with a boss fight against a Robot Master. The platforming and shooting mechanics are an improvement of the previous PC title, but still miles away from what we're accustomed to on the Game Boy or NES. They can feel a bit clunky due to the PC controls and the general chugging of the game. The level design is challenging, but in the sense that it's challenging because it's unfairly difficult and in many instances, downright confusing. Honestly, the music, or lack thereof, and sound and visuals are basically the exact same as the first PC game. It's eerie, creepy looking, and it feels like something I'd have dreamed up if I spent 36 hours straight playing Mega Man with 110-degree fever. Look, I'll be honest, while I was actually able to get through this one, I don't feel like it's really worth my time to break it all down like I generally tend to. The Robot Master designs are repurposed from all throughout the series, but they're not nearly as enticing. It's just a very underwhelming and bastardized Mega Man experience at the end of the day. If you're able to emulate DOS games, I'd say it's not even worth giving it a try. Just like the previous PC game, the best thing I could say is it might be worth your time to find a full YouTube playthrough video and watch it on 2x speed if you have half an hour to kill and want to get an idea of what this game is about. Just keep in mind that the YouTube video won't include the inevitable hour or so extra playtime that you'd experience if you played this game yourself because it's a giant maze with no sense of guidance of where to go. Finally, the one thing I'd like to question is every post and comment I've seen that has praised the PC games. Like, this has to be some kind of hipster joke, right? Do people actually like these games? I saw a few arguments that people said the first one was better than the second one, and vice versa. But even then, how are you going to confidently recommend either of these abominations? I think this game was made by 2 people instead of 1, like the last one, so I hate to continue to be a jerk about it. But in a vacuum, in 2024, playing this game along with all of the other games in the series, it's jaw-droppingly bad. Don't even bother. With the release of the third handheld Mega Man game, the stage was pretty much set on what to expect for these Game Boy titles. As per usual, the game starts off with the 4 Robot Masters from the third NES game that weren't present in the Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy. And the second half of the game has 4 Robot Masters from Mega Man 4, as well as their 4 stages with familiar set pieces from their respective stages. Seeing as how this game includes elements from Mega Man 4 for the NES, primarily the charge shot, this means that you now get to experience the Robot Masters and their stages set pieces from the third NES game with the inclusion of the charge shot, whereas you couldn't do that in the NES. While that's not as groundbreaking as the second Game Boy game including the slide-in stages that otherwise never used to have it, it's still a very convenient addition and gives the experience a bit of uniqueness so that it doesn't just feel like a rehash of the console titles. But let's pull it back a bit. While the first Game Boy title was developed by Minakuchi Engineering, the second one went to Thinking Rabbit. The general reception and opinion of the masses is that the second one wasn't good and it's largely seen as the worst of the bunch because of its developer, who went in a somewhat different route in the design. As such, Capcom quickly turned back to Minakuchi Engineering for the third title, and I'll admit, this one definitely feels more like a sequel to Dr. Wily's Revenge than Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy does. The problem is that I don't think that was for the best. If you recall, I stated that I liked Dr. Wily's Revenge. While many people feel as though the first Game Boy title had poor controls and doesn't live up to the standards of the later games, I argue that if you like Mega Man 1 through 3 on the NES, the first Mega Man game on the Game Boy lives up to those ones, albeit completely washed down. but it's a good game with fair difficulty and control if you're strictly comparing it to the first few NES games. And I still stand by my opinion that it's a better entrance to the series for newcomers than the first two NES titles, for reasons I highlighted in my previous videos, so I won't go too deep into that now. But basically, it's for a lack of beginner's traps and absurd difficulty spikes. Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy I also really liked, and I felt its biggest flaw was that it was way too easy, especially since it had the metal saw. The second biggest flaw is the music isn't as good as the other Game Boy games, but I hardly think the music was as terribly ear-aching as many people like to exaggerate. I feel like the stages had a bit more life in them in the second title too, and they seem to be able to somewhat live up to the console counterparts more than just the first title. I felt like it was just a natural improvement, but after playing this third title on Game Boy, I think I understand why I felt like the second game was such an improvement on the first. I could be completely wrong here, but in the first Game Boy title, the stages were a lot more cramped and straightforward, and the rooms and areas you had to go through were designed appropriately to consider the space around you, leading to some simpler design stages, but they were only really simple based on the design and not the actual application. The application still felt like I was going through Mega Man challenges. In Mega Man 2, the stages felt a bit more designed to reflect the stages that were on the NES. The backgrounds were a bit more detailed and the walls and platforms were more open, leading you to have some more space to move around in. It made the game feel, or at least look, like a less washed down version of the NES games than the first Game Boy game did, which made me enjoy it visually a lot more than the previous game. Going into the third game, we're back to Minakuchi Engineering, and this game looks and plays and feels a lot more like Dr. Wily's Revenge did. The challenges and rooms you run through are a lot more cramped and claustrophobic. I have a theory, and for now this only applies to the first three Game Boy games and not 4 and 5. Since I've heard those games are a lot better designed and don't nearly feel as derivative as the first three. But in regards to the first three games, I've noticed the common consensus, the popular belief for the Game Boy games, is that Mega Man 3 is the best one and Mega Man 2 is the worst one. That seems like the cemented community opinion that has been the case since the 90s. However, for the more recent people experiencing these games, especially on Nintendo Switch Online, or with using a ROM hack to have better visuals or whatever, I'm seeing a lot of opinions stating they actually liked the second one the best and didn't like the first and third ones nearly as much. So my theory is that the reason the second game has historically not been as liked as the other two is because playing it on an OG Game Boy brick in grayscale made it look and feel much worse to go through than it would have if it had at least a minor color palette to help you get around. And when you add on to that how short and easy the game could be, as well as the inferior use of the original Game Boy sound chip on the original hardware, an opinion was developed early on that Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy was by far the worst one, and that opinion just stuck around. But right now, as people are able to experience these games on bigger screens and with official and unofficial color palettes, I think there are more people appreciating what Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy is compared to the first and third title. Because let me tell you, as I was running through Mega Man 3 for the Game Boy, initially appreciating it for not being as easy as Mega Man 2, I quickly grew to hate how frustratingly difficult it was. The game still only took between an hour and a half and 2 hours to complete, even with all my deaths and game overs. But I think if it wasn't for the unfair difficulty, it would have taken over an hour tops. Also, the difficulty in this game is not typical difficulty. It was that archaic difficulty. The kind of difficulty I haven't felt in this series since my NES Mega Man 1 playthrough, and to a slightly lesser extent, Mega Man 2's difficult mode. I'll go into specifics when I run through the actual playthrough experience, but basically it's the kind of difficulty where you can't make a jump without pixel perfectly stepping to the edge of a platform before jumping, or trying to run through a corridor with enemies that take up way too much space, or the unfortunate moments that cause the game to slow down and start to chug because there was too much going on in the screen. I think the boss fights were decent enough, especially since I knew the weakness chain because they're reused bosses. But the stages themselves had a lot of moments of frustration, but it was frustration due to the design and not due to the actual challenges ahead, which I can really only associate with Mega Man 1 for the NES. Strangely enough, the first Game Boy game didn't even have these issues, and I think that's because they made the first Game Boy game easy since they were taking into consideration that it was a handheld derivative. On this title, they didn't care that it was a handheld derivative, and the enemy placement and pixel-perfect requirements of the platforming were a recipe for frustration. There is a saving grace, however, and it's the fact that despite having the charge chart there to help me, I found a lot of use in the various weapons that were available for me to use because there was a lot of locations where a pea shooter or mega buster were just not going to help me out. The dive missile, drill bomb, and dust buster and shadow blades were all used quite a bit when I got them, and the Gemini laser, search snakes, and spark shock also found their use. I didn't really feel like the skull barrier was all that effective, but I also spent so much of this game damage boosting and burning through E-tanks that I didn't need it. Actually, I'll say this straight up. If this game didn't have E-tanks, I doubt I'd have been able to finish it without a rewind feature or save states. I was burning through E-tanks almost as quickly as I was getting game overs. But anyway, I think the fact that I was using so many Robot Master weapons as this game went on got even more difficult in the second half is a testament to how good the weapons were implemented. I'd almost say the level design complements the weapons, but having these weapons didn't really make any of the challenges I faced any easier from a platforming perspective. More like they saved me a lot of pointless time wasting and frustration where I'd have to shoot a pea shooter and hide down a ladder because of a shield charge enemy or something similar. In any case, the story for this one is something to do with Wily digging for oil to draw energy from the Earth's core. Not sure. Either way, you face 4 Robot Masters and then another 4 each with their own stages. But this game doesn't have a boss rush or an elevator room to lead those 4 robot stages, which is a bit different. It's just 2 screens of 4 robots with a quick sub-boss that shows up twice. After all of that, you face a megaman killer named Punk that uses a spin dash. And after that, you face Wily with your newly gained Punk attack. So yeah, it's more or less the same formula adapted from the previous 2 Game Boy games with minor adjustments. You have a rush coil and a watered down rush jet that are seen much more near the end of the game, the ability to carry E-tanks even after game overs, and fun Game Boy renditions of the music from the NES games. Also, as a totally unrelated note, I've thought about this quite a bit, but Dive Man's music is by far my favorite tune in every game up until now. I might have to do a tier list in a later video, but for now I'd say Dive Man's is my favorite, with Elect Man's music, 2's title theme and Wily Fortress Swarm music, and 4's Skull Man's music being close seconds. But without further ado, let's go through this playthrough. I gotta admit, this title screen is catchy. And I don't want to keep going back to the music, but I've recently come to the conclusion that while I always liked Mario and Sonic and Donkey Kong music, so far I think classic Mega Man music might actually edge all of those series when it comes to 90s games. It might be recency bias, but the fact that I can admit that out loud, even with the bias, is more than I thought I'd ever say when it comes to classic games. I opted to start my playthrough with Sparkman. The stage starts off with a familiar challenge involving making it through these electric bolts blocking your path. I don't know why I was really struggling with them in this game compared to the NES. I think the hitbox of the actual bottoms of the pillars is just hard to jump over. The construction workers were easy to pass through though, and likewise with these weird block challenges. These Hammer Joes definitely frustrated me though. I felt like through most of the game they were just inconveniently placed, but I'll get to that when I get to that. Aside from that, there's an E-tank that's out of reach since I don't have Rush Jet yet, and this platforming challenge here really made the game slow down. The next spot is an example of my issue with this, facing off against an enemy that slows down the game. The timing of your fit has to be perfect. You have to shoot it, and jump or dodge or slide so quickly that it almost guarantees you're either going to take a hit or miss the shot. And the enemy takes more than one hit to defeat, so you have to do it 2 or 3 times, which is way too tedious for a simple enemy in a game in my opinion. And it more often than not led to me quickly damage boosting across. While we're at it, let me say this is the first game in the whole series where I found the sound of the charge shot so obnoxious that I had to actually turn the volume down while playing. In normal cases, I use the audio from my playthrough for these sections of my videos, but for this video I found it so annoying that I decided to just throw in a soundtrack as a separate file rather than using the audio captured from my footage. But anyway, when you make your way down, you have to avoid a beginner spike trap and get through these time bombs you set off by jumping on. Get through some of the narrow tunnels with falling blocks and spikes in a lot of locations, with many moments of pixel-perfect jumps that you have to perfectly pull off not to lose a life. And then I was forced to carefully go through a fight with another Hammer Joe. Carefully traverse through a narrow corridor where your jumps have to be almost perfect again, and face off against another one of these guys. You'll notice I had 1 hit remaining through the end of this section, and it's because I burned through so much health damage boosting earlier in the stage that by the time I made it to the latter half of the stage, I had to tiptoe to the end. So it's not that the game is so hard that it's impossible to get through even with low health that makes it frustrating. It's that if you don't slow all the way down, then you're likely to lose a life. And slowing down this much makes the stages less enjoyable in a lot of instances. But this is still the first stage, so let's continue. Luckily, my fight against Sparkman was pretty easy after I lost my first life. The charge shot really helped me against him. But I actually think this is probably not the best first stage to go through, so if you ever play this game, pick someone else as a first stage. Anyway, after Sparkman, I knew the next Robot Master to face was Snake Man. This is a much simpler stage to go through compared to Sparkman's, and I'd say it's a better choice to start the game off. There aren't really many cramped areas, and even the area with the Hammer Joes aren't the worst. Also, there are a lot of snake turrets, but just like in the NES title, they aren't all that egregious to get through, and offer a fun spectacle if anything. I also really like the background of the stage with the trees in the back. It's a good amount of detail for a Game Boy game. The jump over here can be frustrating and can very likely lead to a loss of a life. It's a very wide gap to jump over, and every time you pull back, the enemy flying over it respawns. So not only is a jump where you have to go from the edge, but you basically can't move back at all when making the jump. After that, you have to once again slow down to defeat a Hammer Joe, another big snake, get a treat from Eddie, more sliding, more snakes, more annoying flying enemies, some obnoxious encounters with pole vaulting enemies that required me to use my E-Tank and really slowed the game down. Climb up to the sky, defeat a Hammer Joe, collect an E-Tank, face a lot more similar types of challenges over bottomless pits, this time before making it to Snake Man, and once again discovering that the boss fights are often the easiest parts of these stages, which is very welcome considering that you have to go through hell to get to them. Next up would be Gemini Man. His stage is a good implementation of the NES set pieces onto the Game Boy art style. Most of the stage's intro involve maneuvering around dragonflies with the occasional penguin blocking your path. When you drop in, it's more dragonflies, but this time you're avoiding them while jumping over death spikes. Eventually you make it to the underwater section, where you can use a fully charged Mega Buster shot to blast a whole row of fish eggs out of the way, rather than being forced to shoot them one at a time like you had to in the NES title. This area can be a bit slow, but it's not nearly as tedious as what you might encounter in the rest of the game. After you get through all the fish eggs, you go up and face more dragonflies and enemy-creating penguins, and it's a good chance to farm a bit if you'd like. Continue on through more clusterphobic challenges while avoiding dragonflies over spikes, and you'll eventually make it to Gemini Man, whom you defeat pretty quickly with the snakes. That is if you can maneuver around the game slowing down because of his projectile bouncing around everywhere. Next, we move on to Shadow Man. The stage starts off with areas you have to drop down and set off some bombs to move past, followed by some construction workers and jumping critters you want to get past. It's pretty easy at first, but eventually you get to the area with the kamikaze grenades charging at you. I didn't find them nearly this obnoxious in the NES version, but in this game, because of how little space you have to maneuver, they're so much more annoying to get by. It also doesn't help that you have to destroy the light inhibitors to continue on, because not only do they make the game dark, they also actually slow the game down. When you get to the bottom, you face more jumping critters and dragonflies before making your way across the water while shooting the familiar parachuting enemies. But they're a lot easier to get through now in this game than they were on the NES. Anyway, the stage continues with more of the same challenges and frustrating designs that I've been complaining about for the stages, followed by a fight against Shadow Man that the Gemini attack should make light work of. But man, the Gemini attack once again really slows the game down. After that, you've beaten 4 Robot Masters from the third NES game, and you face off against a mini Wily stage that entails a disappearing block challenge that should be easy enough to get through, followed by a mid-boss fight against a giant Susie. The Spark Shock should help you defeat the big Susie, even if she gives you a bunch of damage. After that, you make it to the second half of the game, and get to the 4 Mega Man 4 bosses. I like Dive Man's music the most, and I started with his stage on the NES, so I did the same thing here. I actually think they did a really good job. They took the familiar elements from the NES stage and found a way to shrink it down to a unique experience. Granted, I think they've been doing that throughout all of the stages, but the difference is when I'm playing this stage, I didn't find it annoyingly difficult. Most of the challenges here were timing my jumps so I didn't hit the spikes on the ceiling, which is a much better challenge than dealing with a bunch of enemies that require pixel-perfect maneuvering in a cramped space. Also, I might have just enjoyed the stage because of the music, and the fights against Moby making me think of how much I like Mega Man 4. But either way, it's an acceptable stage with an acceptable challenge. I like the ending area too, where they take the challenges you've been experiencing throughout the stage and apply it to an area of rising and lowering water levels. It's a good application of the concept of teaching you something early on and making you apply what you've learned into a harder challenge later on. Either way, eventually you make it to Dive Man, and his fight isn't quite as easy as the other fights since we don't have his weakness, but I did manage to defeat him while cycling through all of the weapons I had collected and eventually sticking with the Shadow Blade while using up an E-Tank. With the Dive Bomb received, I made my way to Drill Man stage. If I thought Hammer Joys were annoying because they slowed the pace down of the game, these charging shields were much worse. They're annoying for similar reasons that the Hammer Joes were. I found the Shadow Blade to be helpful through a lot of the challenges though, since I was able to angle its shots, but I also found it was more in my interest to just avoid the charging shields or damage boost through them like I did with the Hammer Joes. Drill Man stage doesn't really have anything super unique about it. The challenge and difficulty through the stage is about what you'd expect going through this game, but more challenging and more frustrating and more annoying than anything else, to be honest. Like, there's this challenge here with the bombs you set off that slowed me down for a bit. The trick is you're supposed to detonate it and jump up as it explodes while moving on. This is like a clear way to make someone get a game over quickly. It's so bad. You basically have to jump when it says 0, but how are you supposed to figure that out without a game over? The stage also includes a lot of these falling rock sections that aren't nearly as tedious as their NES counterparts, so I'll take that win where I can. Drill Man can be defeated pretty easily with the Dive Bomb. I was able to get through him without using an E-Tank or losing a life to refill my health. Next up is the Dust Man. Stop me if you're getting sick of the complaining. More unreasonable challenges, like these jumps over a death pit with enemies flying up that you almost certainly will get a game over figuring out how to get past. and some more charging shields to slow you down to an annoying degree. Even a simple jump to restock your health becomes a challenge because it has to be a pixel perfect jump. Honestly, the one thing I'm surprised about this game is that the jumping enemies were much more defeatable than they were in the other Mega Man games, which was a huge surprise since usually they drive me mad. After you get through another room with a pixel perfect jump, followed by another room with an annoying charge shield, you make it to a similar challenge as we faced in the NES game, except this time, it's so much worse. And not only because you don't have Ringman's attack to help, I can't explain it, but not only was it so annoying how you needed a fully charged projectile to break through, but on your run back to avoid being crushed, you have to perfectly make the jump to the safe area without falling, because if you fall down, you have to restart breaking the blocks down all over again. This was such a frustrating time waster for me. It didn't even kill me, it just wasted my life. A cramped challenge in a cramped game. They somehow found a way to make a claustrophobic experience even more claustrophobic. After I got through the challenge and narrowly jumped over some spikes and annoying bottomless pit challenges with enemies all over the place blocking my path and slowing me down way more than I reasonably should, I carefully continued on, used the drill bomb to collect a 1-up, dealt with another annoying charging shield section over spikes with my dive bomb, and of course had to make 2 perfect jumps to get up to the next section. Eventually I got to an area where I had to use Rush. Thankfully, they gave me enough space to do that, but just barely. Honestly, this stage was really dragging, and as I'm reliving it all again while making this video, I think if anything I was too nice to the game in my introduction. This game is frustratingly difficult and unfair. I don't know how anyone enjoys it. Like, the difficulty of the Dock Robot stages is way better than this. This is just annoying. Anyway, Dustman can easily be defeated with the drill attack as long as you're good about being defensive. With the defeat of Dustman stage, we get to Skullman stage. I think I feel more similar to Diveman stage in that I don't think it's that absurd of a challenge. They took good set pieces from the NES game and implemented it into Game Boy style without making it feel too repetitive. The challenge is fair, the soundtrack is easily a top 5 in all of the games I've played thus far, so that once again might have a role in how much I enjoyed this stage. The important thing is that these stages that I actually enjoyed didn't force you into these tight areas where you had to pixel perfectly get around anything. And I feel like maybe half of the stages in this game had that going for them, whereas the other 4 stages were a lot more obnoxious to get through. But seriously, after Dustman stage, this one felt like a breeze to get through. It was very refreshing. I was even able to easily avoid the charging shield baddies. You face off against those catapults that surprise you from dropping from the top of the screen. In the NES version, they didn't really damage you because you could catch it and slow down before they fall, but over here I found them giving me a bunch of damage. You also face the familiar skeleton enemies with the fully charged shots, otherwise they respawn like dry bones again. But yeah, for the most part, I think this is the kind of difficulty these games should have, where you can still take a lot of damage and still lose a life, but you shouldn't have to be perfect to get through a simple jump or cramped area with an enemy. Also, I don't know if it's just because of how frustrated a lot of these games made me and how many lives in the game overs I went through, but I swear the stages in this game must be longer than a lot of the stages in even the console titles. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it definitely felt like it. Regardless, you can use the Dustbuster to defeat Skullman as long as you shoot him when his defenses are down, which should be easy enough to get through. When you make it to Wily, there's a little cutscene where he runs off, but then a Mega Man killer named Punk shows up, so you have to stop to face him before going after Wily. It's a very easy fight that really just involves carefully dodging and shooting him with your Mega Buster. Similar difficulty to all the other boss fights in this game. When you defeat him, you get the Screw Crusher and move on towards Wily. There's a very quick area to run through that isn't really a challenge compared to everything else we face in this game. You get a lot of repeated set pieces and challenges from earlier, some typical moments to use Rush, ample opportunities to use the different power-ups you collected to advance. Honestly, it feels like in every section you go through it's a challenge taken from a previous stage and just remixed somehow to make it a bit more unique. Which isn't really a bad thing because it makes for a nice spectacle to end the game on. The important thing for me is that it's not hair-pullingly frustrating to get through these challenges. Even the annoying things they bring back aren't quite as annoying, despite the game seemingly trying fairly hard to make them just as annoying as they were earlier. Thankfully, E-Tanks, Rush, and Robot Master weapons you've collected throughout the adventure are here to help you through it all. You also face off against another giant Suzy, and it's a bit harder than the previous one, but nothing the Spark Shot can't take care of once again. You'd think you're done, but the level at this point starts to drag and overstay its welcome for just a bit longer before you make it to Wily. Both phases of the Wily fight are pretty easy, especially if you can burn through your E-Tanks. First phase just takes a few fully charged Mega Buster shots, and when you stand at the edge of the screen you can literally avoid taking damage. The second phase is not hard per se, but it's not easy either. The most important thing is to be patient and not overzealous. It should be easy to finish off Wily if you're more focused on your defenses than your offense, which is easier said than done because Wily defends a lot of your attacks too. Either way, The boss is once again easier than the stage, and you defeat Wily again and finish another game while enjoying a well-produced credits animation with a decent theme. Anyway, look, I don't want to dwell. This game is frustrating. It's too cramped, there's no screen crunch, but the stages themselves are just so squished together that it makes for a very unappealing experience. The bottomless pits you have to jump over that require you to stand right at the edge before the leap are bad enough alone, but the fact that they put enemies over those pits makes it too frustrating. And it's just those kinds of things that ruin the experience. Easily jumping and hitting spikes when you're trying to regenerate some health, having to slow down for minutes at a time because an enemy requires perfect timing to shoot it 4 times to advance, all of it. It's not an enjoyable challenge, it's a frustrating and obnoxious challenge. They literally took the first Game Boy game and were like, how could we make each of these stages significantly more annoying? And they did that. It'd be like if the NES games took the practices from the first NES game and applied them across the series. Like the perfect timing of the disappearing block challenges, or the jumps out of alcoves where you have to jump from your tippy toes, or the Gutsman stage challenge with platforms. It's that kind of annoying. NES annoying. 80s video game annoying. The wrong kind of annoying. But at least the NES titles moved away from this sort of junk. And that's not even including the slowdowns when there's too much going on or the terrible sound throughout the game while you're charging your Mega Buster. Honestly, this game is not worth playing. I'll recommend it to people like I recommend Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels to. And just like with that game, I wouldn't recommend it unless you use a rewind feature. It's just not worth dealing with these archaic challenges that are designed to frustrate you more than challenge you. But look, I think I've said enough. I'm gonna jump around for a bit and break my rules of playing the games in release order and cover Mega Man 4 for the Game Boy as well as Mega Man for the Game Gear together in my next video, since they both have elements primarily from the 4th and 5th NES titles, so I'd like to wrap those up before jumping to Mega Man 6 for the NES. Also, I know Mega Man X released in 1993, so if I'm going in release order I'd have already covered that one, but I'd really like to wrap up the NES games and the classic handhelds before we move on to the X series. So just sit tight for a few more videos and we'll get there. I'm excited, and I hope you are too. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Dean, out.